So we have to talk about Lego's history, let's say, when it comes to the use of and distribution of color when it comes to Bionicle. Right, because while I think the first few years of Bionicle's run are reasonably consistent, by the latter half, things start to really shake up, especially for some specific elements. If you enjoy this content, be sure to subscribe. It helps out the channel, it helps out in the algorithm, and of course, let me know your thoughts. Specifically, what I want to know is, what is your favorite combination of colors used by a character in Bionicle? Let's go ahead and get into this. Now, when I think of a shakeup, if you will, when it comes to colors from Bionicle, I think the primary thing I'm going to think about is the Metru arc, although we'll probably come back to that here in a handful of moments, because when I think of a specific character that really shook things up, it actually has to go to 2006, and more specifically, this character right here, which everybody I think is familiar with. Some people really like this character, some people really don't like this character, and specifically the controversial introduction of this color and unique use of this color to Bionicle. This color right here is a color called very light bluish gray, and while it's not the most common color from Lego in the world, it is used elsewhere outside of Bionicle. Specifically, it was used in a Mindstorm set that gave us a decent amount of lift arms in this color, which means it is something you can build with, though you have to be pretty strategic with it. My Ice Lord Mach actually uses this color pretty heavily alongside standard white. That is his color combination, and so I think ultimately here it works pretty well with the Thok character, and I definitely think this is one of the better characters to introduce a color like this if you're going to do anything like this at all. But why was it done? Well, I have to think that it was probably done because the head directly underneath this mask, and I'm just going to call it that for the sake of the video here, is solid white. Those teeth that you see are solid white. They do have an application of glow-in-the-dark paint over them that's slightly green in tint, but even ignoring that for a moment, it means that had this spine, had this build here been the primary color, standard white, that ultimately the teeth and the head would just kind of blend together. And that's pretty boring, right? So ultimately, by making the spine and the character, for that matter, a different color, it ends up working out in its favor. But also, you could just say that, like, oh yeah, it's a new color. People love new colors, right? I do kind of wish that would have been consistent across other sets as well. But yes, this character would introduce, and in fact, would be the beginning and the end of this color for Bionicle. This color is discontinued from Lego now. In fact, I think it was discontinued sometime around 2006. Don't quote me on that, and I think it is a nice looking color. It's sort of reminiscent of a lot of nostalgia colors from the mid 2000s where everything was getting white and sterile. You had the Wii, you had some other game systems and stuff like that that were using white primarily as well, so like I get what they were kind of going for here, obviously, and it is an aesthetically pleasing color. Thankfully, this character I think does come with enough stuff on it to really lend itself to mocking, right? You have two separate limb types here of the longer variety, plus you have the Metru limb as well, which, while not my preference in terms of limb choice to use for the other arm, in fact, I really don't honestly know why they used it at all. It limits the arm's movement here, as does the spines, but this is not a review of the Paraka here, right? Ultimately, having those knee pad here, having the larger choice of foot here specifically works out exceptionally well, because while I think it would have been cool to get the claws with the silver blend on them in this color, this piece is much easier to use for things like armor, right? Or to just bulk out a character. So ultimately, if you're going to introduce a color like this, having a larger piece as a base to stand on ultimately does work out in the favor of mockists, in my opinion. So it's an interesting color, but he's not the only Paraka to actually include a unique color, because we also get the Avok set as well, which introduces this color right here. This color is reddish brown, and it's quite a fascinating one. It is a color that's still in Lego's repertoire, of course. It is still in production to this day, though there is a lot of variation with it through time in terms of brittleness, of course, but also in terms of just how the color appears from 2006 all the way through modern day. The color has definitely changed with time. But this means that 2006 saw the use of two different shades of brown, two different shades of white as well. But this is interesting to me because it means that we got Velika in this color right here, Avok in this color right here, which has all the advantages of the Paraka Thok set, same parts, just now in that reddish brown color. But then we also get Huki, and Huki's an interesting one. He actually introduces, for the first time ever, the color Keat Orange to the stone characters, the characters that were traditionally brown. Now, I don't know if you consider Huki's primary color this or gunmetal. Personally, I would have loved to have seen that color combination used for Umbra, and then maybe give the Keat Orange and reddish brown or something else to Huki, but I digress from that, because ultimately it means that we got this brand new dual shade for this character, and it does work out well. Then we get into 2007, though, and this is where I think things start to get a little bit more interesting, because Huki still uses this Keat Orange, and now you can argue it's definitely his primary color, but he pairs it with black, and he's not the only character using black as a primary heavy color. Nuparu uses it quite heavily as well, not to mention some of the Titan sets from that year. But I think that it works out reasonably well in this sense, just because Huki versus Nuparu tends to mute the color quite a lot, heavy use of black, but pairing it with just dark gray, and nothing fancy going on there. Whereas Huki, he uses a little bit less, just a little bit less black, but ultimately pairs it with this much brighter shade of Keat Orange. So it's very clear that these are two different characters, even if ultimately I would have rathered Huki use a different color from black for his secondary color. But we move away from that because he's not the only stone character to come out that year, and we run into Karapar. And Karapar is an interesting one because he's one that I quite enjoy. He's probably my favorite Baraki set, and I can't tell you why. I'm definitely biased. He's the first one that I bought. I went out of my way specifically to buy him first. I really enjoy his parts, specifically the unique parts and the dual molding on them, or the marbling on them rather. But even ignoring that for a moment, this character does not use that much in the way of Keat Orange, just 5 sockets and a hip. In fact, you could change those out for Metru Brown if you wanted to keep the brown color in his character, or you could change them for dark tan, you could change them for regular tan. All of those are options. But notably, you look at the character and you see the parts that he introduced specifically for him, the head, that armor piece, as well as the shoulder pads, and they have a really interesting blend because that is blended with Keat Orange. You can especially see it on the knees here. I chose specifically versions of them in my collection that had more of the Keat Orange in their blend than some of the others. But notably, I think it's interesting because it pairs the Keat Orange with such a subtle color like transparent brown that it's probably one of the most organic color combinations I think LEGO's really ever done. Personally, I would love to see them delve into that color combination further, although I don't think that they make transparent brown these days, so that'll probably never happen. And in fact, this color combination is unique to this character as far as I'm aware, outside of a couple of prototypes that I've seen that either use the Keat Orange or potentially gold with trans brown. It's a fascinating color scheme, but is it his primary color? Honestly, it's hard to say what I would consider his primary color, because he also heavily emphasizes gray, and he's in fact the first Bionicle character that I can think of that primarily uses gray as a major statement for him. I guess it depends on if the Baraki came out first where you are, or if the Toamari came out first, because I know Kangu uses the color gray quite heavily as well, but on him I don't quite enjoy it as much because it's also paired with a much darker color in dark green. So you get the dark gray and dark green, and I just don't think that that really does enough to lift that character up, right? But this character relies quite heavily on the dark gray, and I think he's all the better for it. Now, I will say I have tried him with the Metru Brown. I don't really care for it that much, but I'm not the world's biggest fan of Metru Brown to begin with, so maybe you'll enjoy it more than me. Let me know your thoughts on this character as well. But we move on, because here's where I think things start to get a little bit more problematic for me, and it is the shift into 2007. And 2007 introduces 3 characters that could potentially use the Keat Orange color, but only one of them does, and it's not one of the major Toa or Fantoka, Makuta, Mystica, whatever characters, right? Rather, it's Toa Ignika in his own separate Titan set or vehicle set, right? So Toa Ignika ends up using the Keat Orange color, and I think this ultimately is why our hero, Pohatu, and our villain, Bittle, don't use it, right? To sort of give Ignika his own unique color. Obviously, by 2008, it's not a unique color. It's still paired with black that year as well, although it has a heavier emphasis on silver in my opinion. But it means that Pohatu shifts his color scheme to orange, which is definitely fascinating, because while I would definitely have considered Keat Orange or yellow colors primarily a fire color family, adjacent color, right? I understand the use of it for stone characters. I know in like a lot of Eastern traditions specifically as well, yellows and colors like it are used pretty heavily to represent things like stone and earth. So like I totally understand the use of it, but orange to me is even more evocative of something like fire, right? We'd seen it up until this point almost exclusively on fire characters outside of Nuparu in the past, speaking of him. So I do find this quite interesting that now suddenly we're getting a character like Pohatu evolve who could have introduced the color brown, and I think he could have done an okay job with it, if only because it would have been paired with something like dark gray, because he's in the Fantoka series and they all use that dark gray color. But orange, it's not the worst choice here. I especially appreciate it, and I think I appreciate it even more since his mask is essentially just a Vahi in homage, if nothing else, but it's still a really fascinating one at the end of the day. However, Bittle is more interesting to me for a few reasons. Yellow, rather than Key to Orange, which I think would have worked better for Bittle for a few reasons. He's a Makuta character. I like to think of Makuta as being like evil primarily, and I think that this color just being more saturated, warmer than yellow, maybe saturated is not the right way to phrase that, but a warmer color feels a little more evil, if you will, right? So I think something like this would have worked a lot better for a character like Bittle because, you know, he's a villain at the end of the day. But, you know, I digress. Still, yellow and black, it works out well enough. He does introduce a new limb in that color in the form of the Rakshi limb. Later on, Hero Factory in the Corroder set would give us some other yellow parts as well. So we do end up buffing up that color representation from Bionicle, from Lego, at the end of the day. But it's still really fascinating to me because ultimately he is just this separate shade all his own. And then we shift into 2009, and finally we have brown, tan back, right? Well, we kind of have brown. The Vorok's armor on his shoulders and on his knees is tan blended with this reddish brown color, so it is there. It's subtle, it's mild use at best, but the tan and black obviously works exceptionally well. I think, and I've said this before, I've even talked about it in a previous video, that ultimately the Vorok set could have sold even better if it had paired the black, or rather the tan, with a more bold color choice like dark red, because tan and dark red go together exceptionally well. Lego designed an entire theme around it in the form of Dino Attack 2010, right? But also, ultimately at the end of the day, pairing the tan with a color outside of black, I think it subverts expectation a little bit, and it sort of invokes some of what Lego was trying to do with like the Baraki and stuff, for example. Now, I don't think that Vorox is bad for pairing tan with black. He's one of my favorite of the Glatorian, even if ultimately his weapons are kind of boring. But yeah, it is interesting that we see this color return. So isn't it lovely that, of course, the Glatorian Legends abandoned tan? Of course they did. I understand why. Again, you've got Toa Matanui, which now at this point sort of has this history of using Key Orange in the past, right? Dakar obviously picks up the mask. Maybe that's how you can even think he first associates it with the color. I have no idea. Obviously, Toa Ignika is Key Orange in his primary color. So yeah, the Toa Matanui set being Key Orange makes total sense. And I think he wears it well. I do think he looks quite good in that color scheme. Maybe the best to have used it outside of Huki. I still think that the gunmetal looks really exceptional with that color. But ultimately, it's a fascinating choice. Now, I don't want to just focus on one white character and then all the brown characters, because like they're not the only characters to see some really interesting choices in the way of Lego. You know, 2004, I think, is probably the most obvious, the most daring change of color for Bionicle, because 3 characters of 6 changed to a darker tone. And if it hadn't been for Oniwa, like, all of 2004 would have been darker. This color is the only one to get brighter than the previous color. But again, bright's probably not the right term because it's still a very desaturated shade of brown. I can't make the necessary opinion of which of these two is a brighter shade of brown, but it is at the very least lighter than something like this, right? Ultimately, it's fascinating to me that 2004 would see this change, and I think it is sort of a seismic shift that ultimately tells us, it foreshadows the direction of which Bionicle is going. Darker, grittier, it's growing up with its audience, but it's also going down one very specific path. And I've talked in previous videos about why I think in some ways 2007 Bionicle is a sort of renaissance for the theme. And I don't say 2006, right, when I think things really did shift quite heavily. But I specifically pick up 2007 because it feels like it's not trying to be edgy or, you know, ride any trends that were popular in the way that like the Anika and the Paraka did, right? They could feel a little cringy. Their advertising, I think, doesn't age quite as well. But 2007 feels a lot more like it's trying to be its own thing. Bionicle, absolutely. Is it trying to be classic Bionicle? No, not at all. And I think that's also the difference between 2007 2009. Is 2009 is in a lot of ways trying to be classic Bionicle. It just doesn't hit the mark perfectly all the time. I do appreciate 2009 for what it is, and I think it got close, not perfect by any means. And there are definitely things that I would do to address 2009 to, I would say, make it better, but that's of course my choice, maybe for a different video. Ultimately, Bionicle, yes, has had a very strange history when it comes to color, and I'm at least thankful that colors would tend to rotate with time. I think, you know, Lego's receipt of the reception of the Kongu set from 2007 helped them to sort of shift away from dark green to lime green as a color for characters, because the Kongu set was just so boring. Lovely mask, I absolutely stand by that. Great that we got the Rockshi feet in dark green, finalizing the fact that we could now build the Rockshi in dark green, which you can do if you didn't know that. But ultimately, yeah, Lego's history with color, especially when it comes to Bionicle, not to mention 2015 and G2, which does its own things with color, is fascinating. And I appreciate it for that. Because at the end of the day, I do think that Bionicle would have been boring if over the years we had went from having, you know, like 18 different colors in the first year in 2001 Bionicle, and then shifting that all the way down to just 6 colors, 6 colors, 6 colors, 6 colors. And it's like, that's cool, and that's good for parts, right? To give you parts in as many colors as possible. One of the reasons I think the set like this suffers is that, yes, while that color there is nice, it is an aesthetically pleasing color in my personal opinion, because it's relegated to just this one set. It does mean it can be difficult to build characters with this color, but not impossible by any means. Same is true for the Avox set as well. Reddish brown being a color Lego still uses definitely helps. The Ogrim set from Hero Factory definitely helps, since it had the Paraka 3-toed feet in the reddish brown color. But ultimately, it is still an interesting choice and set of choices that ultimately led us to where Bionicle would go. Before I end the video, I just want to show that, like, this is probably also an obvious thing, because there are definitely more than 6 Paraka. I mean, outside of just the story having more. But even if, you know, you think of Vizon, almost forgot his name there for a second, and you could do things like this with the silver spines that, you know, came out in 2007. Lovely piece, definitely should have been used outside of 2007. Bionicle should have continued to use that piece, but whatever. And of course, you have like the Paraka stars, you have the Ernak set, which has the gold spines as well. So like those parts did see a lot of love, and yeah, it's fascinating. Anyway, that's it for this one. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. It helps out the channel, of course. And let me know your thoughts. Like I said, specifically, just who wears it best? Who wore it best in your favorite colors? Or if you want to give a bigger, broader answer of the 6 elements of Bionicle that saw sales on store shelves, alliteration, let me know which character from each of those 6 elements is your favorite. I talked about how I think Jalar Mari is probably my best choice in terms of aesthetic from a Fire Toa set. I don't know if I'd say he's my favorite personally, but just trying to look at him objectively. But what about Ice and Stone and Earth and air/jungle, I guess, and water, etc.? Which of each of those themes, and fire for that matter, which character is your favorite to represent each of those? Anyway, that's it. Take care.